poor mountain man bought a burned church for his last dollar. What happened next was a miracle. He was down to nothing, a single silver coin in his pocket. And with it, he bought the one thing no one in town wanted, a burned-out church, blackened and broken. The townsfolk laughed. The cattle baron swore he'd take it back. The sheriff warned him to leave. But this ragged drifter saw something in those ashes that no one else did. Then came the widow and her boy, carrying their own scars, begging for a place to belong. Together, they began to rebuild what fire had stolen. But just as the walls rose, flames returned in the dead of night, and whispers spread that maybe the widow herself had set the blaze. Jail doors slammed, keys rattled. The dream seemed lost. Yet in the ruins lay a secret no one expected, a truth hidden in smoke and scripture that could change everything. When one poor man dares to fight greed, prejudice, and despair with nothing but faith and courage, will the town rise with him? Or will darkness win again? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Charles Cross shifted his weight, boots crunching on the ash-covered ground of the auction yard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across weathered faces in the crowd. His mule nickered softly behind him, the only friendly sound among the jeers and whispers that rippled through the gathered townspeople. "Next up for bid," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "The old church property." He gestured toward the blackened skeleton of the building, its charred beams reaching toward the sky like pleading fingers. Fire took. In last week, land and what's left of the structure, starting at $1. Laughter scattered through the crowd. Charles watched as people shook their heads, some spitting into the dust. The church stood as a dark monument to destruction, its windows nothing more than empty sockets staring out at the world. $1, the auctioneer repeated, his voice growing impatient. Surely someone sees value in this fine piece of property. More? Laughter. A man near Charles muttered, "Ain't worth the match that burned it." Charles felt the weight of his last silver dollar in his pocket. He'd earned it trapping in the high country, meant to use it for supplies. But something pulled at him like a gentle hand on his shoulder. Without fully understanding why, he stepped forward. $1, he said, his quiet voice cutting through the chatter. The crowd fell silent. Charles pulled out the silver coin, its surface catching the dying sunlight. He placed it carefully on the auctioneer's table, ignoring the stares boring into his back. The auctioneer blinked, then recovered. $1 bid. Do I hear two? Silence answered him. Going once, going twice. The gavel cracked down. Sold to the gentleman in the buckskins. Scattered laughter erupted again. Fool's purchase, someone called out. Another voice added, Might as well have thrown that dollar in the creek. Charles accepted the deed with steady hands, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into his shirt pocket. He nodded to the auctioneer and turned away from the dispersing crowd, their mockery falling away as he approached the ruins of his new property. The setting sun painted the charred timbers in shades of gold and purple. Charles ducked under a fallen beam, his boots leaving prints in the thick ash. The air still held the acrid smell of smoke, mixed with the musty scent of rain-soaked wood. Empty nail holes gaped in the few standing boards, marking where pews had once been secured. As dusk began to settle, Charles moved carefully through the rubble. His hands brushed against blackened wood, feeling the rough texture of destruction. Near what had been the altar, a pile of debris caught his eye. Something glinted beneath the char, the tarnished corner of a book's metal clasp. Kneeling, Charles gently lifted away the burned timber. His calloused fingers found the half-burned Bible, its leather cover scarred by flame. Many pages had been reduced to ash, but others remained intact, protected somehow by the weight of the fallen roof. The fading light was just enough to read by. Charles opened the Bible carefully, its surviving pages crinkling beneath his touch. His eyes fell on a passage that had escaped the fire. "For I will restore health unto thee, and I will heal thee of thy wounds, saith the Lord." The words seemed to glow on the page, speaking directly to the hollow place in his chest that had been empty since his wife's passing. Charles sat back on his heels, the Bible cradled in his hands as shadows lengthened around him. Later, as night fell, Charles made his camp beside the ruins. He built a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows on the church's remaining walls. His mule dozed nearby, occasionally stamping a hoof in the darkness. Above, stars wheeled across the vast sky, countless points of light in the velvet blackness. Charles lay on his bedroll, the half-burned Bible resting on his chest. The passage about restoration kept running through his mind. He didn't understand why he'd spent his last dollar on this burned-out shell of a church. The sensible thing would have been to ride on, find new trapping grounds, continue the solitary life he'd built since losing Sarah. But something had changed. The stars overhead seemed to watch, patient and eternal, as Charles wrestled with uncertainty. He felt both foolish and oddly peaceful, as if he'd stumbled onto a path he couldn't yet see clearly, but knew he had to follow. The night deepened around him, cricket song rising from the grass. Charles closed his eyes, his hand resting on the Bible-scarred cover. He was a man of few words, more comfortable with trap lines and wilderness trails than with matters of faith. Yet here he was, owner of a ruined church, with nothing but determination and 2 empty hands to rebuild it. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in pale gold when Charles began his work. His muscles protested as he lifted the first blackened beam, sending a cloud of ash into the air. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to everything, making him cough as he carried the charred wood to a growing pile near the church's former entrance. Townspeople began passing by on their morning errands, their whispers carrying clearly in the cool air. "Look at that fool, wasting time on burnt timber. Reckon that dollar could have bought him a decent meal instead of a heap of ashes." Charles kept working, his weathered hands steady as he sorted through the debris. The sun climbed higher, bringing with it the heat of late summer. Sweat darkened his buckskin shirt as he methodically cleared the ruins. The clip-clop of hooves made him pause. Sheriff Alton rode up on his dappled Maury, reining in at the edge of the property. The lawman's badge caught the morning light as he shifted in his saddle, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Mornin'," the sheriff drawled, eyeing the slowly clearing space. "Seems you might want to know something about this property you bought." Charles straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. He waited silently for the sheriff to continue. "Silas Brand had his eye on this lot," Alton said, adjusting his hat. "Been planning to expand his saloon business this way. Man like that doesn't take kindly to his plans being disrupted." "The auction was fair," Charles replied quietly. The sheriff shook his head. "Fair don't always matter much to men like Brandt. My advice? Take your loss and move on before trouble finds you." Charles turned back to his work, lifting another beam. The sheriff sat a moment longer, then clicked his tongue and rode away, leaving only hoofprints in the dusty street. The sun reached its peak, beating down mercilessly. Charles had cleared a significant portion of the smaller debris when he noticed 2 figures approaching from the east end of town. A woman in a simple dress, her dark hair bound back with a faded ribbon, walked beside a small boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They stopped at the edge of the property, hesitation clear in their stance. The woman's features marked her as Apache, and her son shared her deep brown eyes and proud bearing. "I am Mariel," she said softly, her English careful but clear. "This is my son, Tomas." She gestured to the ruins. My husband once prayed here before the fever took him. If you will allow it, we would help clear the ashes." Charles studied them for a long moment. The boy clutched his mother's skirt but met Charles's gaze steadily. Finally, Charles nodded, pointing to a section of debris that needed clearing. Mariel worked efficiently, her movements graceful despite the grimy task. Tomas proved surprisingly strong for his size, carrying smaller pieces of wood to the pile. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional guidance Charles offered about where to stack materials. As the afternoon waned, the sound of multiple horses approached. Silas Brandt rode past with two of his men, their mounts' hooves kicking up dust. Brandt was a large man who carried himself with the swagger of wealth, his vest adorned with silver, buttons that gleamed in the late sun. "Well, well," Brandt called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Quite the collection of labor you found yourself." His smirk carried clear contempt as his gaze swept over Mariel and Tomas. "Don't get too comfortable with this project. That land won't be yours long enough to matter." Charles said nothing, but moved slightly, positioning himself between Brandt and his helpers. The cattle baron's smirk widened. No response? Probably wise. Brandt gathered his reins. "Enjoy your temporary ownership." He spurred his horse forward, his men following close behind. Mariel and Tomas left as evening approached, promising to return the next day. Charles watched them go, then set about making his simple camp. The town's windows began to glow with lamplight as darkness settled in. He ate a spare supper of jerky and hard bread, watching his small fire cast dancing shadows on the partially cleared church ground. His last silver dollar could indeed have bought him supplies, maybe even a few nights in a proper bed. Instead, he had traded it for what looked increasingly like an impossible fight. Brandt's influence clearly ran deep in the town, and Charles was a stranger with empty pockets and few allies. The fire crackled softly as he looked at the progress they'd made that day. It wasn't much, but the sight of Mariel and Thomas working alongside him had awakened something he thought long buried, a sense of purpose. Perhaps, or the first stirring of hope. Dawn broke clear and crisp over the church ruins. Charles adjusted, his worn leather hat against the morning sun, surveying the creek that meandered past the edge of town. Good-sized stones lined its banks, perfect for foundation work. "These will serve," he said, demonstrating to Tomas how to test each rock's stability. The boy nodded eagerly, his small hands already reaching for a suitable stone. Mariel worked steadily beside them, her skirts tied up practical fashion as she waded ankle-deep in the cool water. She had a keen eye for the right shapes, selecting stones that would fit together naturally. They formed a line, passing rocks from the creek to growing piles near the church foundation. The morning stage rumbled past, stirring dust into the air. Townsfolk began their daily routines, many pausing to stare at the unlikely trio. Two women in Sunday-best dresses stopped near the general store, their whispers carrying clearly. "Did you see? That Apache woman working right there in plain sight. And that mountain man letting her? What's this town coming to?" Charles noticed. Mariel's shoulders stiffened, though she kept working. Tomas pressed closer to his mother's side, his previous enthusiasm dimming. But before Charles could speak, a new figure approached from the direction of the boarding house. Mrs. Lydia Green, a widow known for her quiet ways, carried a cloth-wrapped bundle. Her gray-streaked hair was neatly pinned, and she twisted her apron nervously as she neared them. Without a word, she set the bundle on a flat stone and retreated a few steps. "Fresh bread," she said softly. "Still warm." She glanced at Mariel and Tomas, then back at Charles. For all of you." The aroma of fresh-baked bread wafted through the morning air. Tomas's eyes widened at the sight, and Mariel offered a gentle smile that made Mrs. Green blush before hurrying away. They had just resumed their work when the distinct thump of an uneven gait drew their attention. Amos Harlan, the one-legged veteran carpenter, made his way toward them. He leaned heavily on his crutch, his grayed beard unable to hide deep scars that spoke of battles long past. "Saw you hauling stone," he called out, his voice gruff but friendly. "Reckon you'll be needing proper timber work soon enough. These old hands still know their way around a saw if you're of a mind to accept help from a broken-down soldier." Charles studied the older man, seeing past the limp to the skilled craftsman beneath. "Much obliged," he said, nodding. "Could use a man who knows his trade." Amos's weathered face creased in a smile. "Well then, let me show you what these hands can still do." He propped his crutch against a stone and lowered himself carefully to examine the foundation lines they'd started. The morning passed steadily until the sun stood high overhead. The sharp crack of boots on packed earth announced new arrivals. 3 of Brant's men swaggered through the church grounds, their gun belts prominent on their hips. "Well, ain't this touching?" The tallest one sneered, deliberately kicking over the nearest pile of stones. They scattered across the ground, nearly striking Tomas. "Building churches with Indians now. Might want to watch your back. Heard they got a habit of burning them down after." Charles straightened slowly, his hands curling into fists. Heat rose in his chest as he stepped forward, but a gentle touch stopped him. Mariel's hand rested lightly on his arm, her eyes carrying a quiet wisdom. "They seek to provoke," she said softly. "Violence would only prove their lies." The men laughed, kicking over another pile before sauntering away. Charles watched them go, gradually relaxing his fists. Amos spat in the dust behind them. "Cowards," the veteran muttered. "Always were, always will be." They worked until the sun painted the western sky in deep oranges and purples. As others headed home, Charles retrieved his old trapping axe from his saddlebags. The wooden handle was smooth. From years of use, solid oak that had served him well. With careful strokes of his knife, he began shaping the wood. Mario built a small fire, its warmth welcome as evening cooled the air. Tomas curled up nearby, watching the flames dance while Charles worked the wood. Slowly, a simple cross took shape beneath his blade. When he finished, Charles planted it firmly in the cleared ground near the center of where the church once stood. It wasn't fancy, but it stood straight and true against the darkening sky. Lamplight began to flicker in windows across town as night settled in. Mariel gazed at the cross, then closed her eyes. A soft melody rose from her lips, a hymn half remembered. From mission days. "Amazing Grace," she hummed, the gentle notes carrying on the evening air. Tomas snuggled closer to her side, his eyes heavy with sleep. Charles sat near them, feeling the warmth of the fire and something more. For the first time since losing his wife, the hollow ache in his chest eased slightly. Here, among these outcasts and broken souls, he felt the first stirrings of what family might mean again. The days flowed together like the creek waters, marked by the steady rhythm of work. Morning fog gave way to bright sun as Charles and Amos raised fresh-cut beams into place. The veteran carpenter, despite his wooden leg, showed remarkable skill with saw and hammer. "Ain't nothing sweeter than the smell of fresh pine," Amos declared, running weathered hands along a beam. "Reminds me of better days." Mrs. Green had taken to appearing each afternoon, carrying a large iron pot of hearty stew. "Can't build on empty stomachs," she'd say, ladling portions into tin cups. Her quiet presence became as regular as the sun's path across the sky. On the third morning, 2 small figures approached the worksite. Clara, a girl of 14 with determination in her stance, gripped her younger brother Luke's hand tightly. "Sir," Clara addressed Charles, chin held high despite her patched dress, "we can fetch nails from the mercantile." Luke's quick, and I know how to sort them proper." Charles paused his work, studying their thin faces. "And what would you want?" "In return? Just a corner to sleep," Clara replied. "The stable's getting cold at night." Charles glanced at Mariel, who gave a slight nod. "There's space by our fire," he said. "But you'll earn your keep." The children proved invaluable, scampering between workers with supplies and fresh water. Luke's cheerful whistling became part of the daily sounds, mixing with hammer strikes, and saw rasps. Words spread through town about the fool's church rising from ashes. Some called it charity work, praising the effort quietly. Others sneered, predicting failure. But day by day, more outcasts found their way to the site. A Chinese laundry worker offered rice at midday. A freed slave skilled in masonry examined their foundation work, offering advice. The stone settled firmly into place, forming a strong foundation. As afternoon light turned golden one day, Mariel sat beside Charles, watching Tomas and Luke play with smaller rocks. "My people had a chapel," she said softly, her eyes distant. "Small, but it was ours. When they moved us to the reservation, they promised we could rebuild it." Her fingers traced patterns in the dirt, but promises break like dry twigs. The agent said there was no money, no lumber. Our elders still gather where it should have stood, praying under open sky. Charles set down his tools, listening. "This place," Mariel continued, gesturing to the rising walls, "it matters. Not just wood and stone, but hope. A promise kept." The silence stretched between them, filled with understanding. Charles stared at his calloused hands. "Lost my Sarah 7 winters ago," he finally said, voice rough. "Fever took her fast. Haven't bent knee in prayer since. Figured God wasn't listening anymore." Mariel's hand found his shoulder, gentle as a breeze. "Perhaps he waits, like these stones, for someone to build again." The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges. Clara organized the younger children into a game, carrying small stones in a line like ants. Their laughter echoed across the churchyard. Pure and sweet. Charles stood, surveying their progress. The foundation stone sat solid and true, the beginning of walls stretching upward. Amos had shaped the door frame with careful precision. Even the scattered trash and ashes had been cleared away, revealing good earth beneath. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar lightness. Hope, he realized. Not the desperate kind that burns fast and dies, but something slower, steadier, like a seed, taking root in spring soil. At the edge of town, near the saloon, 3 of Brant's men lounged against hitching posts. Their eyes never left the church site, faces dark with calculation. They made no move yet, but their presence hung. Like storm clouds on the horizon. The workers continued their tasks. Undaunted, Mrs. Green stirred her stew pot while humming hymns. Clara taught Tomas to stack stones in careful rows. Amos marked measurements on fresh lumber. His gruff voice softened when explaining his craft to Luke. Charles watched it all, remembering Mariel's words about promises kept. The foundation stones beneath his feet felt solid, ready to bear whatever weight might come. Around him, this unlikely family of outcasts had found their own kind of belonging, building something greater than themselves, stone by careful stone. Sunday dawned with a gentle warmth that seemed to wash the air clean. Charles stood among the half-finished walls, running his hand along the rough-hewn timber. The morning light caught dust motes dancing through gaps where windows would soon be. "Reckon we could rest today," he said to Mariel, who was arranging wildflowers in a clay jar. Maybe read some from that Bible we found." She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I will tell Tomas." Word spread quietly through their makeshift family. By mid-morning, people began drifting toward the church site. Clara and Luke arrived first, their faces freshly scrubbed. Mrs. Green brought a basket of cornbread, still warm from her oven. Amos limped in, leaning heavily on his cane but wearing his cleanest shirt. They settled on wooden crates and stones arranged in rough rows. Charles had positioned his father's old trunk at the front, draping it with a faded quilt to serve as a makeshift pulpit. The half-burned Bible lay upon it, its scorched edges a reminder of where they'd begun. More figures appeared at the edges of the gathering. A few town women stood uncertainly near the back, drawn by curiosity. 2 ranch hands paused their Sunday errands, watching from horseback. Even the Chinese laundry worker who'd shared his rice stood quietly in the shadow of a wall frame. Charles cleared his throat, suddenly aware of all the eyes upon him. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the Bible to where he'd placed a leather marker. "I ain't no preacher," he began, his voice rough. "But these words, they speak true, even if I read them poorly." He began to read, stumbling over some of the longer words. The passage spoke of mercy, of old things passing away, and new life springing forth. Though his delivery was halting, the simple truth of the words seemed to fill the unfinished space. Tomas sat cross-legged near the front, his dark eyes wide and attentive. Beside him, Luke whispered the familiar words along with Charles, having learned them at his mother's knee before the wagon train tragedy. Clara kept one arm protectively around her brother's shoulders, but her usual tension had softened. A warm breeze rustled through the open beams above, carrying the scent of sage. Mariel's quiet voice lifted in a hymn she remembered from the mission. Chapel, the melody pure and clear. Others joined hesitantly. Mrs. Green's wavering soprano, Amos's deep rumble, the children's sweet notes. From across the street, Silas Brand emerged from his saloon, drawn by the sound. His face darkened as he watched the gathering. The few customers at his rail turned to stare as well, whiskey glasses forgotten in their hands. Brandt's glare bore into Charles like a branding iron, but Charles kept his eyes on the Bible's weathered pages. The simple service concluded as the sun climbed toward noon. People lingered, sharing Mrs. Green's cornbread and quiet conversation. The town women who had watched from the back edged closer, one offering a tentative greeting to Mariel. Charles noticed how Amos had gathered the children around him, telling them stories of the fine churches he'd helped build back east. Luke sat at the old carpenter's feet, completely absorbed, while Tomas leaned against his mother's skirts, listening just as intently. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the gathering slowly dispersed. Charles worked at banking their cooking fire for the evening as Mariel approached, her shawl drawn close against the cooling air. "Thank you," she said softly. "Today, I felt Miguel's spirit here." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "He would sing those hymns while he worked, teaching them to me. He always said true worship needs no fine walls." Charles nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Looking around at their unfinished church, rough beams reaching skyward, stone foundation, solid beneath their feet, he realized something profound. This place, dismissed as a fool's dream, already held more life than any saloon Brand might have built. Here, hope had found root in the ashes. The evening settled around them like a gentle hand. Clara helped Thomas gather kindling while Luke and Mrs. Green tidied away the remains of their shared meal. Amos sat whittling by the fire, his wooden legs stretched out comfortably before him. Charles spread his bedroll near the warmth of the coals, his body weary but his heart oddly light. The stars winked through the open rafters, and a peace he hadn't known in years wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. As sleep approached, he heard Mariel humming softly to Tomas, the same hymn from their morning worship. The sound followed him into his dreams, gentle as a prayer. 2 days after their first service, dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them a deluge that threatened to wash away their progress. The rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming against the half-finished walls and turning the churchyard into a sea of mud. Charles fought his way through the downpour, his boots sinking ankle-deep in the muck. Above him, the newly placed roof. Beams groaned under the weight of the water. Canvas tarps, hastily thrown over stacks of precious lumber, snapped and billowed in the wind like angry sails. "The ropes!" Amos shouted over the storm's roar. "They're coming loose." Struggling through the mud, Charles grabbed a length of rain-slick rope. His feet slipped beneath him as he tried to secure a corner of canvas. Just as he was about to fall, warm hands gripped his arm, steadying him. "I have you," Mariel said, her dark hair plastered to her face. Together they pulled the rope taut, protecting the lumber they'd worked so hard to gather. Thomas darted between the walls like a determined sparrow, his small frame leaning into the wind as he carried bucket after bucket to catch the worst leaks. His usually bright face was set with concentration, refusing to let the storm defeat them. "Clara! Luke!" Charles called out, spotting the orphans huddled against the most complete section of wall. They clung to each other, Clara's arms wrapped protectively around her younger brother. Their clothes were soaked through, but their eyes showed more worry for the church than themselves. "Under the lean-to," Mariel gestured to them. "Help Thomas with the buckets there." Hours crawled by as they fought the storm. Mrs. Green arrived with hot coffee in a large pot, passing tin cups among the workers. Even old Amos refused to leave, propping himself against a beam to direct others despite his wooden legs sinking into the mud. As evening approached, the rain finally began to slack. Charles stood in the gathering dusk, surveying their work. The walls still stood. The lumber was saved. Somehow, they'd held together. "We did it," Mariel said softly, coming to stand beside him. She passed him a steaming cup of coffee, and they moved under the crude lean-to where they'd stored their tools. The children had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from their efforts. Clara and Luke were curled together like kittens on a pile of dry sawdust, while Tomas dozed nearby, one hand still clutching an empty bucket. "Thomas loves this place already," Mariel said, her voice warm with affection. "He talks of nothing but ringing church bells when we finish." She smiled, watching her son's peaceful face. "He says the sound will reach all the way to heaven." Heaven. Charles felt his heart tighten at her words. He looked down at his calloused hands, thinking of the massive bell that would be needed, the copper wire, the wooden frame, all things that required money he didn't have. The $50 in his pocket felt very light against the weight of Brant's wealth and influence. "That's a fine dream," he managed, not wanting to dim her smile with his worries. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle patter of dying rain and the children's soft breathing. The coffee's warmth spread through Charles's tired muscles, and he found himself studying Mariel's profile in the lantern light. There was such strength in her quiet presence, such unwavering faith. Outside in the darkness, unseen by either of them, a shadow moved. One of Brant's men crouched in the mud behind a stack of timber, watching. The rain dripped from his hat brim as he observed the scene through the lean-to's open side, taking note of every detail, every person present. Inside, Charles shifted closer to Mariel, drawn by the simple comfort of companionship he'd missed for so many years. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying, for helping. Most folks would have run from this storm." "We are not most folks," she replied, her eyes meeting his with gentle understanding. "And this is not most churches." The lantern flickered, casting warm light across the sleeping children, the rough-hewn beams, and the two people sharing coffee in the growing night. Despite the storm's fury, their small sanctuary held firm, sheltering the unlikely family that had formed within its walls. Morning broke clear and bright, washing away memories of yesterday's storm. The sun painted the wet timber golden as Charles stepped out from beneath the lean-to. His boots squelched in mud, but his eyes were fixed on the wooden cross he'd carved from his old trapping axe handle. It leaned against the wall, smooth and waiting. "Reckon today's the day," he said quietly, running his hand along the polished grain. Amos limped over, his wooden leg leaving distinct impressions in the softened earth. "Fine piece of work there, Cross." The veteran carpenter squinted at the beam. "We'll need 4 men on ropes to raise her proper." Word spread through their small group quickly. Mrs. Green arrived with fresh bread and excitement in her eyes. Clara and Luke appeared from wherever they'd been sleeping, faces bright with anticipation. Tomas ran ahead of his mother, nearly tripping in his eagerness to help. "Steady now," Amos called, directing the placement of ropes. "Charles, you take the main line. Mariel, stand ready with that guide rope." People began gathering at the edges of the churchyard. Some townsfolk paused on their way to market, while others deliberately came to watch. Charles heard their whispers, felt their expectation of failure, but kept his focus on Amos's instructions. "Ready?" Charles asked, gripping the rope firmly. "Pull." Amos commanded. The cross rose slowly, swaying as they fought against its weight. Charles's arms burned with the strain. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool morning air. The beam wavered, threatening to topple. "Hold fast!" Amos shouted. "Mariel, guide rope to the left." Mariel moved with grace, adjusting the rope's tension. The cross steadied, inching higher. Clara and Luke clutched each other's hands, watching. With wide eyes, Mrs. Green whispered what sounded like a prayer. Then, with a final heave, the cross slid into its prepared socket. Charles quickly wedged stones around its base while Amos checked the angle. For a breathless moment, everyone waited. The cross stood straight and true, catching the morning sun. Its shadow stretched across the half-built walls like a blessing. A cheer burst from the orphans. Clara spun Luke in a circle of joy, while Tomas jumped up and down, pointing. Mrs. Green wiped tears from her eyes with her apron. Even a few townspeople joined in with polite applause. Charles stood back, his chest tight with emotion. The sight of the cross against the blue sky brought back memories of Sunday mornings long ago. Sitting beside his wife in their hometown church, she would squeeze his hand during prayers, her faith as natural as breathing. The ache of missing her was still there, but now it mixed with something warmer. Hope, perhaps, or healing. "It's beautiful," Mariel said softly, coming to stand beside him. Her eyes reflected the same quiet joy he felt as evening approached. Mrs. Green insisted on preparing a celebration. She set up her cook fire near the church walls, filling the air with the smell of hearty stew. Amos contributed a jug of coffee, strong enough to put hair on your chest, as he claimed with a wink at the children. Lanterns cast pools of golden light around their gathering. Clara helped serve the stew while Luke proudly passed out tin cups. Tomas sat cross-legged by the fire, telling anyone who would listen about the bell they would hang someday. Laughter rang out when Amos shared tales of his carpentry mishaps, his gruff voice softening as he described teaching his own son the trade. Years ago, Mrs. Green hummed hymns as she stirred the pot, and even Charles found himself smiling more than he had in years. The cross stood sentinel above them, its outline sharp against the darkening sky. In its shadow, their unlikely family shared bread and stories, bound together by something stronger than blood. Across the street, lamplight spilled from the saloon's windows. Inside, Silas Brandt nursed his whiskey, glaring through the glass at the cheerful scene. The cattle baron's face twisted as another round of laughter drifted over. "Mark my words," he muttered to his cronies gathered around the table. "That church will never open its doors." He took another bitter drink, but couldn't wash away the sight of the cross standing proud against his wishes. Back at the churchyard, Charles ladled more stew into Thomas's bowl, watching the boy's eager face in the firelight. For this one moment, everything felt right. The weight of his last silver dollar spent no longer seemed like a burden, but a blessing multiplied in ways he never could have imagined. The lanterns glowed warmer as night settled in, their light catching the fresh-cut wood of the cross. It stood as a promise, not just of faith restored, but of a family found among the broken and cast aside, gathered together beneath its outstretched arms. The crackle of flames woke Charles from his sleep beneath the lean-to. His eyes snapped open to an orange glow reflecting off the chapel walls. Fire danced along the fresh-cut beams, hungry flames already climbing toward their newly raised cross. Fire! Charles bellowed, scrambling to his feet. Amos, fire! The veteran carpenter emerged from his makeshift shelter, his wooden leg thumping against dirt as he moved with surprising speed. The water barrels! He shouted, already limping toward them. Charles grabbed 2 buckets, his heart pounding. The flames were spreading fast, consuming the timber they'd worked so hard to raise. Smoke billowed black against a star-filled sky. Tomas! Mariel's voice cut through the chaos. She ran toward the burning structure, her shawl pulled over her mouth. Mariel, wait! Charles called, but she had already disappeared into the smoke-filled doorway. His stomach clenched as he heard her coughing inside. She emerged moments later, clutching Tomas's treasured blanket, the one remnant from his father. Soot streaked her face, but determination burned in her eyes as she joined the bucket line. The commotion drew townsfolk from their beds. They came running in nightclothes, some already carrying buckets. Mrs. Green organized them into a chain, passing water from the horse trough to the flames. Save the cross, Amos directed, his voice hoarse from smoke. Don't let it fall. Charles worked tirelessly, his arms aching as he threw bucket after bucket of water at the hungry flames. Clara and Luke ran between people, refilling empty buckets. Tomas stood frozen, watching his beloved church burn, tears cutting clean tracks. Down his dust-covered cheeks, dawn broke pale and gray over the smoldering ruins. The wall still stood, blackened but intact. The cross remained upright, though charred on one side. Charles leaned against a post, exhausted, surveying the damage. Through stinging eyes, a commotion drew his attention to the street. 3 of Brandt's men approached, pointing accusatory fingers at Mariel. Everyone saw her going in there, one shouted. Indians burning churches. Ain't that just their way? That's a lie. Charles stepped forward, fists clenched. Sheriff Alton rode up, his horse's hooves clicking against packed earth. He dismounted slowly, chewing his tobacco as he assessed the scene. Got witnesses saying they saw her near the fire first, the sheriff drawled, not meeting Charles's eyes. Have to take her in for questioning. Just procedure, you understand. She was saving her son's blanket, Charles protested. These men work for Brandt. They're the ones who... You got proof of that. Sheriff Alton cut him off. No? Then stand aside. The sheriff approached Mariel, who stood straight-backed and dignified despite the accusations. Come along quietly now, he said. Taking her arm, Tomas broke free from Clara's grasp and ran to his mother. Mama, no, he cried, clinging to her skirts. Mariel knelt down, cupping her son's tear-streaked face. Be brave, little one, she whispered in Apache. Stay with Charles. He will protect you. Charles watched helplessly as the sheriff led Mariel away. The town seemed to split in 2 before his eyes, some folks whispering suspicions about that Indian woman, while others stood firm with crossed arms, clearly troubled by the injustice. Mrs. Green gathered Tomas into her arms as he sobbed. Amos spat in disgust at the departing sheriff's back. Clara and Luke huddled close to Charles, their young faces worried and confused. Through the morning, Charles worked mechanically to clear The debris, his mind on Mariel sitting alone in a cell. As sunset painted the sky crimson, he made his decision. He found a spot outside her cell window, settling onto the hard-packed earth. The jail's lamplight cast bars of shadow across his face. "Charles?" Mariel's voice drifted softly through the iron grate. "I'm here," he answered, leaning his head back against the wall. "I won't leave you alone." "Tomas?" "Safe with Mrs. Green. She's teaching him to make biscuits." A quiet laugh, though it held tears. "He loves biscuits." They sat in companionable silence as night deepened around them. Charles thought of how far they'd come from that first silver dollar spent on ruins. Now the church stood damaged but defiant, its charred cross still reaching skyward. And here he sat, keeping vigil for a woman whose strength and dignity had helped build not just a church, but a family. "We'll prove your innocence," he promised softly, "whatever it takes." Through the window came her quiet reply, "I know." Charles settled in for the long night, his resolve as solid as the foundation stones they'd laid together. He would not let her face this injustice alone. Morning sunlight revealed the full extent of the damage. Charles stood amid the scorched timbers, with Clara, Luke, and Amos, their faces grim as they surveyed the destruction. The half-built walls rose like blackened bones against the pale sky, testament to their ruined dreams. "Reckon we could save some of these beams," Amos said, running his calloused hand along a charred post. His wooden legs scraped against debris as he moved. "Might need extra bracing, but they're solid at the core." Clara clutched Luke's hand tight, her 14-year-old shoulders bearing the weight of yet another loss. "What if they come back?" she whispered. "What if they burn it again?" Charles knelt beside a fallen beam, his weathered fingers tracing the fire's path. "Then we'll rebuild again," he said firmly, though his heart ached at the sight of their destroyed work. The cross above them stood dark against the morning light, its shadow falling across their small group like a reminder of their purpose. Inside the jail, Mariel knelt on the rough wooden floor, her prayers mixing Apache and English. In a quiet stream, through the barred window, she could see glimpses of her son playing listlessly in the dusty street. Her hands, pressed together, trembled slightly as she prayed for strength, for justice, for her boy's tender heart. Tomas wandered between the workers as they cleared debris, his small face pinched with worry. He watched Charles lift a scorched timber, and suddenly burst out, "Is God mad at us?" Charles set down his load, turning to face the 8-year-old boy. Dust and ash coated them both, marking their shared struggle. The question hung heavy in the air, echoing Charles's own doubts from years past. "Come here, son," Charles said softly, settling on a relatively clean beam. Tomas approached, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You know how sometimes, when spring comes, there's burned grass on the prairie?" Tomas nodded, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "And what happens after?" "New grass grows," Tomas answered quietly. "Mama says it grows stronger." Charles smiled, though. His heart ached at the mention of Mariel. That's right. Sometimes miracles start in ashes. God ain't punishing us. He's giving us a chance to build something stronger. The boy's shoulders straightened slightly, hope flickering in his dark eyes. "Like the cross? It didn't fall." "Just like that," Charles agreed, ruffling Tomas's hair. "Now, how about helping Mrs. Green sort those nails we saved?" As evening approached, Charles watched the townsfolk drift away, leaving their small band. Alone once more, Amos stayed late, sketching plans for repairs in the dirt with his walking stick until the light grew too dim to see night settled over the town like a heavy blanket. Charles strapped on his revolver, its familiar weight both comfort and burden against his hip. He began his solitary patrol around the church lawn, boots crunching on scattered debris. The moon cast strange shadows through the skeleton of their building, making every movement seem suspicious. Across the street, Brandt's saloon blazed with light and life. Raucous laughter spilled from its doors, along with the tinny sound of a jazz piano. The contrast struck Charles like a physical blow, their darkness and destruction against that golden glow of prosperity. He could almost imagine Brandt watching from his office window, satisfied with his handiwork. Charles's hand brushed the grip of his revolver, an old instinct from his trapping days. But violence wouldn't save them now. They needed something stronger than bullets or fists to overcome this evil. He completed another circuit of the property, checking the shadows for threats. The night air carried the lingering smell of smoke, a bitter reminder of their vulnerability. Yet beneath that acrid scent, he caught the fresh tang of raw lumber, the new beams they'd stockpiled for tomorrow's work. Pausing beneath the charred cross, Charles looked up at the star-filled sky. Words he hadn't spoken since Sarah's death rose to his lips, rusty but sincere. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "show me a way." The prayer felt strange, like a key turning in a long-locked door. "Not for me," he continued, thinking of Mariel in her cell, of Tomas's tear-stained face, of Clara and Luke's tight-clasped hands. For them, for this place. The saloon's piano struck up a lively tune, and fresh laughter echoed across the street. But Charles stood firm, his prayer a quiet defiance in the face of Brandt's seeming victory. Whatever came next, he would not abandon this mission. In the ashes of their work, he had found something worth fighting for, a family forged in fire, a faith rekindled by need. He touched the crosspiece that had once been his axe handle, remembering how it had transformed from a tool of solitude to a symbol of community. Perhaps he too was being transformed, tempered by this trial into something stronger than before. Dawn brought Charles to the sheriff's office, his boots leaving dusty prints on the worn wooden steps. Inside, lamp oil and coffee mingled with the musty smell of old wanted posters. Sheriff Alton sat behind his desk, methodically cleaning his revolver as though it were more interesting than the man before him. "You know she didn't do it," Charles said, his voice low but firm. He planted his hands on the desk, forcing Alton to meet his gaze. "Mariel was with us when that fire started. Her own son was sleeping in there." Alton reassembled his gun with practice moves, each click punctuating the tense silence. "Evidence says different, Cross. 2 witnesses saw someone matching her description near the church before the fire." "Brandt's men," Charles spat. "They were lurking around all evening. Everyone saw them. Hearsay." Alton shrugged, but his eyes shifted away. "Unless you've got someone willing to testify against Brandt's people?" Charles straightened, frustration tightening his jaw. Through the barred door, he could see Mariel in her cell, sitting straight-backed despite the circumstances. Her quiet dignity made his heart ache. "Sheriff," he tried again, "you know this isn't right." Alton's chair creaked as he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's something else you should know, Cross." He pulled out a drawer, extracting a thick sheaf of papers. "Brandt's lawyer filed these yesterday. Claims the auction sale wasn't legal. Says the previous owner never properly registered the deed." Charles felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's impossible. I have the paper right here." He pulled the auction deed from his vest pocket, spreading it on the desk. "Look at the dates," Alton said, pointing to fine print. "According to these documents, the original owner sold to Brandt's company 3 days before the auction. If true, they had no right to sell it to you. 3 days before?" Charles's voice rose. "That church burned 4 days ago." "You're telling." "Emmy Brandt bought burned ruins?" Alton spread his hands. "Papers look legal to me. His lawyer's demanding the sale to you be voided." "So that's the game," Charles growled. "Frame Mariel for the fire, then steal the land through paper tricks." "Watch yourself, Cross," Alton warned, but his tone lacked conviction. "These are legal matters now. Best you take your loss and move on." Charles slammed his palm on the desk, making the inkwell jump. "Like hell I will." He stalked toward the door, then turned back. "You know what's right here, Sheriff. Question is, are you man enough to stand for it?" Outside, the morning sun felt too bright, too cheerful for the darkness gathering around them. Charles paced the boardwalk, mind racing. They needed proof, something to show Brandt's schemes for what they were. That evening, as Charles shared their meager supper with Clara and Luke beneath the charred cross, Clara spoke up suddenly. "Remember what you found that first night, Mr. Cross? In the ashes?" Luke nodded eagerly. "The Bible. You said it was a sign." Charles set down his tin cup, memory stirring. That half-burned Bible, discovered in the rubble the very night he bought the lot. He hadn't thought about it since, too busy with rebuilding. Rebuilding. "Might be something in there," he muttered, more to himself than the children. Rising quickly, he strode to his pack, where it lay against a scorched beam. The Bible was wrapped carefully in oilcloth, protected from weather and work. Under them, last rays of sunset, Charles settled cross-legged and began examining the burned book. Its leather cover was scorched but intact on one side. He ran his fingers carefully along the edges, feeling for anything unusual. Clara and Luke crowded close, their breaths hushed with anticipation. "What are you looking for?" Luke whispered. "Not sure yet," Charles answered, turning the Bible slowly in his hands. "But sometimes folks use these old family Bibles to store important papers. Letters, deeds." His voice trailed off as his fingers found an irregularity in the cover's leather. A slight bulge, barely noticeable unless you were searching for a dot with trembling hands. He probed the edge where fire had loosened the binding. Something crackled beneath his touch. Paper, hidden between the leather and the cover board, preserved. By its secret pocket, through fire and time. Charles looked up at the darkening sky, then at the eager faces of the children beside him. Whatever this hidden document might reveal, he prayed it would be enough to save both Mariel and their cherished church from Brandt's corrupt grasp. The lantern's glow cast dancing shadows as Charles worked the Bible's leather binding with careful fingers. Clara and Luke huddled close, their breath visible in the cool night air. Even Amos leaned forward from his perch on a scorched beam, his one good leg stretched out before him. "Easy now," Amos cautioned as Charles eased his knife along the loosened edge. "That paper's liable to crumble if you rush it." Charles nodded, focusing on the delicate task. The leather separated slowly, revealing a yellow document folded into the spine. His hands trembled slightly as he extracted it, laying it flat on a wooden plank beneath the lantern's light. "What's it say, Mr. Cross?" Luke whispered, eyes wide with excitement. Charles squinted at the faded ink. The formal handwriting sprawled across the page, still legible despite age and wear. As he read, his breath caught in his throat. "It's a deed," he said, voice rough with emotion. "The original deed to this land, signed 40 years ago by the town's founding families." He traced the words with his finger. "It grants this plot to the people of this town in God's trust, that might gather in his name for generations hence." Amos stumped closer, adjusting his wooden leg on the uneven ground. "Let me see that." He took the paper with weathered hands, examining it through squinted eyes. "Well, I'll be damned. Begging your pardon. That's Judge Morrison's seal at the bottom. This here's binding law, Charles. Brandt can't touch it." Clara clasped her hands together. "Does this mean we can save Miss Mariel? We'll sure try." Charles carefully folded the precious document and tucked it into his shirt. "First light, we're paying the sheriff another visit." Sleep proved elusive that night. Charles kept one hand near the deed, as if it might vanish like smoke. As pink light touched the eastern sky, he saddled his mule and rode toward town, hope burning bright in his chest. The sheriff's office was already open, lamp burning against the dawn shadows. Alton looked up from his desk, coffee cup halfway to his mouth, as Charles strode in. "Got something you need to see," Charles said, laying the deed carefully on the desk. "Found this hidden in that old church Bible." Alton set down his cup and pulled the document closer, brow furrowing as he read. His eyes widened at the seal. "This is—" He trailed off, reaching for his spectacles. "The original deed," Charles finished, "proving that land belongs to the town, not Brant or anyone else, and proving he filed false papers to try stealing it." "Well, now," a sharp voice cut through the office. Silas Brant stood in the doorway, his expensive boots gleaming. "What tall tale you spinning this morning, Cross?" Charles turned slowly. "No tale, Brant. Just truth coming to light. Same truth that'll show who really set that fire." Brant's face darkened. His hand twitched toward his gun belt. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you a thief," Charles said evenly. "And worse. Sheriff, you've got 2 crimes here. Attempted land theft and arson. Plus an innocent woman sitting in your jail while the real criminals walk free." Alton studied the deed again, then looked between the 2 men. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. "This seal, it's genuine. And the grant language is clear." He cleared his throat. "Mr. Brant, I'm afraid your claim to that land is void. And given these circumstances, I'll need to investigate the fire allegations more thoroughly." "You gutless coward," Brant snarled. "You know who owns this town." But something had shifted. Through the office windows, Charles saw townspeople gathering, drawn by the raised voices. Their faces showed curiosity, then recognition as word of the deed spread in whispers. "Not you," Charles said quietly. "Not anymore." Brant's hand dropped to his holster. "I can still burn it again. Burn it all, and anyone fool enough to stand in my way." A murmur rose from the crowd outside. Mrs. Green's voice rang out clear. "You'll burn nothing more in this town, Mr. Brant." Other voices joined hers, growing stronger. The sheriff stood, adjusting his badge. "Mr. Brant, I suggest you step away from that gun. We've got some questions need answering." Brant's gaze darted around the room like a trapped animal's. His hand fell from his gun. "This ain't over," he growled, backing toward the door. The crowd parted silently as he stormed out. "Sheriff," Charles said firmly, "about Mariel." Alton was already reaching for the cell keys. Yes. Given these developments, he hurried to unlock the cell door. Mariel stepped out, dignity intact despite her ordeal. Her eyes met Charles's, filled with quiet gratitude. Outside, the morning sun touched the church's scorched walls with golden light. The townsfolk's voices rose in excitement, hope flickering to life like a freshly struck flame. The courthouse buzzed with tension as townsfolk packed the wooden benches. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Charles sat straight back beside Amos, the precious deed laid carefully before them on the polished table. Brant's lawyer, a sharp-featured man from the city, stood with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, this supposedly ancient document appeared quite conveniently. We question its authenticity and legally binding nature." Judge Peterson, white-haired and stern, adjusted his spectacles. "The seal appears genuine, Counselor. Do you have evidence suggesting otherwise?" "The property has stood abandoned for years," the lawyer pressed. "Mr. Brant's development plans would benefit the town's growth. This mysterious deed serves only to obstruct progress." Amos shifted in his chair, his wooden legs scraping the floor. The judge nodded toward him. "Mr. Harlan, you've lived here 40 years. What can you tell us about this church's history?" Standing with effort, Amos squared his shoulders. "Your Honor, I helped raise those first walls myself, back in '38. Judge Morrison himself dedicated that land. said it was to be God's house for all people, red or white, rich or poor. His voice grew stronger. That deed bears his seal, sure as I'm standing here. I remember him putting papers in that very Bible during the ceremony. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Brant's face darkened as he whispered furiously to his lawyer. "The court calls Mariel White Mountain," the judge announced. Mariel rose gracefully, her simple dress clean despite her jail stay. She walked to the front, head high despite the hostile stares from Brant's men. "Tell us of your connection to this church," the judge instructed. "My husband, John White Mountain, prayed there," Mariel said clearly. "He found welcome when other doors were closed. Before he died, he taught our son Tomas the hymns he learned within those walls." She turned to face the crowded room. That church stood for what this town could be, a place where all God's children gather as one family. Charles watched faces in the crowd soften. Even the judge removed his spectacles, wiping them slowly. "Your Honor," Brant's lawyer interjected. "Emotional appeals aside, my client has invested considerable." "I have heard enough," Judge Peterson cut in. He lifted the deed carefully. "This document's authenticity is beyond question. More importantly, its purpose is clear: to protect this land for the community's spiritual welfare." He squared his shoulders. "I rule that the property shall remain as granted, a house of worship for all people, protected from private sale or development." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Mrs. Green dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief while Clara and Luke hugged each other. Grinning, Charles exhaled slowly, tension draining from his shoulders. Sheriff Alton stepped forward, badge glinting. "Your Honor, given this ruling, I must address the matter of the recent arson attempt." He glanced at Mariel apologetically. "New evidence suggests Mr. Brant's involvement. I request authorization to take him into custody for questioning." "You can't prove anything," Brant snarled, rising. "This is persecution." "Sit down, Mr. Brant," the judge ordered sharply. "Sheriff, you have the court's approval. Mrs. White Mountain is hereby released, all charges dismissed." Brant's men started forward as the sheriff approached, but Brant waved them back. The fight had left his eyes. As Alton led him away, his followers traded uncertain glances, then slipped out of the courthouse. Charles made his way to Mariel through the celebrating crowd. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Mama!" Thomas burst through the courthouse doors and ran to her. She caught him up in her arms, holding him close as he babbled excited words in Apache and English mixed together. Charles felt a light touch on his arm. Mariel had extended her free hand to him. He took it, marveling at its strength and gentleness. Around them, the townspeople clustered close, offering congratulations and apologies. "Reckon that fool's church of yours wasn't so foolish after all," Amos said, clapping Charles on the shoulder. Through the courthouse windows, Charles could see the church's scorched walls rising against the bright sky. Soon those walls would echo with hymns again, English and Apache voices raised together, just as Mariel's husband had once dreamed. The law had spoken, and justice had prevailed. Mrs. Green stepped forward, smiling through tears. "We'll need to plan a proper celebration when the rebuilding's done." "First the work," Charles said, still holding Mariel's hand. "But we've got plenty of help now." Thomas tugged at his sleeve. "Can I ring the bell when it's finished?" "Mama says there used to be a bell." "We'll raise the biggest bell in the territory," Charles promised, and the boy's face lit up with joy. In the days following the trial, wagons creaked into town laden with fresh-cut lumber. Merchants who had once turned their backs now offered supplies freely. The sound of hammers rang from sunrise to sunset as men worked shoulder to shoulder, raising walls that would shelter all. Women gathered in Mrs. Green's kitchen, baking bread and stirring great pots of stew for the workers. The orphans, Clara and Luke, darted between scaffolds with paintbrushes. turning weathered wood bright and clean. Even the sheriff pitched in, hauling shingles up to the roof as December deepened. Soft snow began to fall, dusting the new-laid stones. Charles watched in wonder as the church rose higher than before, its bones stronger for having been tested by fire. Mario worked alongside him, teaching Tomas to weave pine boughs into garlands. On Christmas Eve, lanterns cast golden light through windows that sparkled with frost. Inside, fresh-cut pine scented the air, and polished benches stood in neat rows. The wooden cross Charles had carved gleamed above the altar, no longer bearing scorch marks. Families filed in as evening fell, merchants and ranchers, Apache relatives in blankets bright with ceremony, widows leading children by the hand. Charles stood at the door, greeting each one, hardly believing his eyes. When all were seated, he opened the half-burned Bible with trembling hands. "The light shines in the darkness," he read, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "and the darkness has not overcome it." Mariel began to sing, her clear voice lifting in an old hymn. Others joined, the melody swelling until it filled every corner of the sanctuary. Tomas, grinning with pride, pulled the rope that Amos had attached to the new bell he'd donated. Clear and bright, its song rang out across the snowy town. Charles looked over the gathered faces, every shade of skin, every walk of life, all joined in celebration. Here was the miracle he'd never dared to hope for. Not just rebuild walls, but rebuild hearts. As the bell's echo faded, he saw tears on many cheeks, and knew they felt it too. After the final hymn faded, no one seemed eager to leave. The newly built church glowed with warmth and fellowship as lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls. Children darted between the benches, their laughter echoing off the high ceiling. Clara chased Luke around a post, while Tomas showed them a game he had learned from his Apache cousins. Mrs. Green shared her mother's Christmas cookie recipe with 3 other women, their heads bent close together near the pot-bellied stove. Amos, leaning on his cane, regaled a circle of listeners with tales of his younger days, his weathered face animated in the LAMPLIGHT. Charles stood by the doorway, marveling at how the same townspeople who had once mocked his fool's church now lingered here like family. Men who had sneered at him weeks ago now clasped his hand warmly, their wives offering invitations to Sunday dinner. Even the sheriff removed his hat respectfully as he passed, nodding in acknowledgement of how wrong he had been. Outside, snow continued to fall in lazy spirals, each flake catching the golden light streaming from the windows. The fresh powder already lay thick on the ground, unmarred except for the tracks of arriving congregants. The night air rang with clarity, carrying the sounds of joy from within the church across the sleeping town. Charles watched Tomas showing Clara and Luke how to make snow angels, their small bodies creating perfect impressions in the white blanket. Their giggles rose like music, reminding him of everything that had been won here, not just a building, but healing for a broken community. Mariel appeared at his side, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. She slipped her hand into his, the gesture as natural as breathing. "You gave us more than a church," she said softly, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You gave us a home." Charles squeezed her hand gently, remembering that first day when he had laid down his last silver dollar. "No," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I just spent my last dollar. God gave the rest." Above them, the bell that Thomas loved. So much began to ring again, its clear voice carrying across the snow-hushed town. Each peal seemed to announce that hope had returned to this place, that miracles could grow from ashes. Standing there with Mariel's hand in his, watching the children play in the snow, Charles felt the last empty places in his heart filling up. The years of loneliness since his wife's death seemed to fade like old shadows. Here, finally, he had found not just purpose but family. In these walls, In these people, in the love that had grown from a single act of faith, the burned church, that had once drawn mockery, now stood as testament to God's grace, transformed from ruin to miracle. Looking at the faces around him, Charles knew he was home at last. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.